Dr. Louise,
My
over
name's
to you.
Louise. Oh, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
My name's Louise. I'm a professor in wildlife ecology at Massey University, and I am the Director of Ord Wildlife Response for New Zealand.
That was a quick and short introduction. So again, my name is Lih Hern. I'll be the host for today as well as one of the presenters. I'm a principal consultant with OSRL. So I have interest in the wildlife response. When I first joined the company as well, we produced a paper together with my colleagues, Norman Rotmos, and we also collaborated with Dr. Louise in terms of getting one of the first remote training sessions that has integrated wildlife response as well as traditional oil spill response. And that would be one of the remote sessions that we have done this year. So let's zoom into the content. And the first would be, I mentioned, we will focus from the on-field itself. And this would be Dr. Louise Chilvers to share with us. And over to you.
Thank you, Lih Hern. Take control.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about the whole Ord wildlife response, but we're really going to concentrate on the first two aspects of Ord wildlife response. So let me run through the three main aspects of Ord wildlife response, and then you will know what I mean by the first two. So there are three main aims of Ord wildlife response. And the first two are ones that are not usually clearly outlined or understood by many people, but it doesn't even involve the animals getting oiled, which is a good thing. So the first aim of an Ord wildlife response is always to keep oil away from animals, so to avoid oiling in the first place. And that can be done by working with operations teams, booming off areas so that oil doesn't get into areas where animals breed. It involves your Ord wildlife component because we are the people who have the expertise of where those animals are, where the important areas and the sensitive sites are that you would want and understand how to boom them off or to avoid and stop the oil going into those areas. So step one is always keep oil away from the animals if possible, avoid. Step two is keep animals away from oil. So if the oil is spilled and there is, nothing that we can do about it, how can we get animals out of the way of the oil spill? How do we get them to move or capture them and prevent them from going into oiled areas? The slides up here are from our colleagues in Gowers from Focus, and it's an area near the mouth of the Mississippi, which the top left-hand corner was 4 days before oil was expected to hit this area. And they got out there with noise-making machines and flags and all sorts of hazing and deterrence equipment. And by the time the oil reached them, I think pretty sure there was only about 20 birds left that they had to actually collect and de-oil and rehabilitate. So the second one is keeping animals away from the oil. And those are the two sections that we will cover explicitly today. But realistically, what most people understand about oiled wildlife response is the third one, which is about capturing oiled animals, washing them, rehabilitating them, and releasing them, which of course is remedy. So to go through, just like an oil response, the first steps in an oiled wildlife response is reconnaissance, ground truthing the information, not only about the oil, but about animals. Where are animals found? What species are there? Because, animals vary depending on what the season it is, whether they're breeding, their numbers, their locations, their behaviour, their habitat that they're found in. All of those things vary depending on what season it is, what the weather is like, all of those sorts of things. So the first step is always about ground truthing, reconnaissancing, where is the oil? Where's it possibly going? What animals are in the way? What's likely to happen if the weather changes or, the season changes and animals start to migrate, or all of those sorts of things. Part of this process is also part of the monitoring, starting the monitoring process. And throughout the entire oiled wildlife response, from the very beginning, from reconnaissance all the way to the end, monitoring never stops. It is a continuous process in an oiled wildlife response. It collects information that works in with the oil response operations team and intelligence team. It's continuously bringing in information about where animals are seen, where oiled animals are seen, how animal numbers or distribution will change over time. It also helps direct operations, oil cleanup operations. Maybe, if the weather's going to change and it's going to push the oil that way, can we put a deflection boom in so that it doesn't go all over a tern colony or a booby colony, or out of an area, stay out of an area where dugongs are, things like that. And this is an ongoing process, and it's very important because a lot of people just see monitoring as that first stage, that reconnaissance, but actually monitoring has to occur throughout the entire oil response. So those are the first two steps once oil has hit the water. We then go on to look at during reconnaissance, looking more in depth about identifying oiled and at-risk wildlife, ground truthing that information, which hopefully is already in an oiled wildlife response plan, and provide real-time backup information on that. So what numbers are there? What species are there? I'm sure if any of you have ever looked at a species list for your area or your city or anything like that, you will see lots of common species, but then there's occasional species and rare species. It also involves looking at their threat classification. Are they an endangered species? Are they a common species? And how this changes through time. It's really important to have this reconnaissance to ground truth that information, identify the priority areas or habitats. I mean, priority areas are always going to be things like estuaries, mangrove systems. To lead back into operations, how can this either lead to containment of the oil or cleanup of the oil in those sensitive habitats? How do we get in and deter wildlife from getting into those areas if they're not already in there? And then to lead into the wildlife operations section of recovering those animals. And how do you recover animals without adding to the problem of the area? Recovering animals from mangrove areas, which is oiled, can be quite tricky because you don't then want to add to the impact of the oil by tramping the oil into mangroves, putting it into the mud systems and all of those sorts of things. So this is why those first two steps are really important, the reconnaissance and the monitoring sections. And it's really to identify those priorities and species. So you're looking at areas that are breeding, areas where animals breed, whether it be turtle nesting areas, areas where animals roost, particularly birds, obviously. How do we keep oil out of those areas, or how do we get the animals away from those areas? And that's one of the really big things to consider. You're never going to stop a female turtle coming back and breeding on her nesting beach. That is her absolute drive in life, all of those sorts of things. So you have to take that into consideration when you're considering an oiled wildlife response. You can't stop the animal going there, but, a lot of countries have the ability, once turtle nests have been laid, that they can remove the turtle eggs and put them somewhere else safe. They know how to do that without disturbing the eggs too much, and take them out of the way of the oil. There's other complicating things which, that reconnaissance and ground truthing is trying to find and prioritize. Things like feeding areas for animals. So, the bottom right-hand corner is a dugong feeding. If oiling is in that area, again, it's pretty hard to shift a 600 kilo dugong. But is there other feeding areas that they can be encouraged into? Is it an area, because, dugong feeding areas where where seagrass is usually quite shallow. Is it an area that you can put a reflecting boom in to reflect the oil away from that area, all those sorts of things. And this is how, that first step, reconnaissance and monitoring, feeds into the operations, feeds into how an entire oiled wildlife response is run. Other options, once you have prioritised those areas and those species, is can we get those animals out of the way before the oil hits? So deterrence, can we move those animals away? Like the example I gave for the Mississippi River, is making a lot of noise, is making a lot of disturbance. Can we get them out of that area? But animals are only going to move if there's another area for them to go to. So feeding, there's examples in more temperate areas where you could go and plough a paddock of potatoes and you'll get all the waterfowl, you'll get all the ducks and all the geese and all that away from a feeding area that might be oiled, but into another area because there is a food supply there. You have to give them another area to go to. Animals won't just disappear into the ether. When you scare them, they have to go somewhere. So that's part of that monitoring and reconnaissance as well, to work out if you do disturb them, where are they going to go? Prevent them from entering an area. Humans have been doing this for just as long as humans have existed, really, with scarecrows and protecting, putting nets over harvestable fruit, all of those sorts of things. So how do you utilize that sort of techniques to stop animals entering an oiled area? And then, stop affecting the wildlife. As I've said, can we work with operations? Can we put in booms to deter, stop the oil or reflect the oil and put it into another area that is less of an important area, less of a special site? One of the prevention techniques is called preemptive capture. And this is where wildlife is caught before becoming oiled, and are either held in captivity until the risk of oiling is past, or are translocated to another habitat where risk does not exist. So unlike deterrence or hazing, where you're making the animals move naturally, or under their own steam at least, here you are capturing them and taking them somewhere else, or holding them in captivity until the risk has passed. And that photo is a photo of a New Zealand dotterel, and during the MV Rena, so New Zealand's last major oil spill, we captured and held 60 of these birds until the risk had passed, because they're such tiny little birds. If they were oiled, pretty much they are straight away under severe risk of dying. So these are examples of those first steps: reconnaissance, hazing and deterrence. How can we work in the whole oil response team to get that to operate? You do have to be really careful, and you do need wildlife expertise. I hope no one's squeamish for the photo, sorry, to undertake this, because especially for things like preemptive capture, there are risks. There are risks to the animals, and even within captivity, there are risks. So these are some of the risks. So birds quite often get a thing called capture myopathy, and it's pretty much the same as us going into shock. And they go into shock from being scared so much by being caught. And so you have to have the skills and the knowledge for that species to even consider that in the first place. Being caught can cause injury. The least would be damage to their feathers, but they can have broken legs, broken wings and all that. And that is obviously the completely opposite of what you're trying to achieve. Capturing any animal is very stressful for an animal. And not only could it cause stress, but it could cause mortality. And then once an animal is in captivity, you have disease risks in captivity. You have complications by holding them in captivity. An example for these little guys, the New Zealand dotterels, is that they're very, very difficult to get to feed on an artificial food type. So they had to be hand fed for anywhere between 10 and 15 days before we could get them on to feeding themselves. And again, that's very stressful for the bird. It means they had to be handled twice a day, all of those things. So although preemptive capture is a fantastic and wonderful procedure, you really have to think about it before you do it. And it really does need wildlife expertise to be undertaken. Even translocation, capturing the animals and translocating them to another area. timing has to be thought of. Are the seasons just about to change? Are migratory birds just about to take off or come home? All of those sorts of things. And that's really why, you know, wildlife and oil wildlife response needs to be integrated and work completely within the oil response system. So a quick run through, you know, how do we run an oil wildlife response and what sort of resources are we talking about? So it's very similar to an oil response. You know, you need people, you need equipment, and you need planning. Hopefully plans are already developed long before oil hits the water. An additional thing that you need for oil wildlife response is a facility that you can capture and bring in wildlife to, clean them and respond to them. But like most of these resources, the most important one is the personnel. And that's a large part of the training that OSRL do, the training that we do, is trying to upskill personnel so they have an understanding of what wildlife response is and having an understanding of the number of people that are actually needed most of the time to undertake this sort of work. So, personnel in an oil wildlife response team is a huge wide range of skills. It's not just wildlife people. There's all the admin people, you know, and cleaning staff for a facility, all of those things. There's very definitely the technical staff that are needed, veterinarians, vet nurses, capture specialists, species specialists. But we also just as much need managers, people managers, HR, all of those things. It's really important to have local people with local knowledge, understanding the species distributions in the area, the conservation priorities for the area, having people with handling experience, advice into the incident command, and familiar with local hazards. That's not only geography, but that's people as well. One thing that's not on my list there is also local knowledge of customs and laws and all of those things. They're very important. A rule of thumb, which is very give or take, but when you have a response which contains only birds, I must add, a rule of thumb is for about every 100 birds, you're going to need 50 people on a wildlife team. Excuse me. So my example of that is the MV RENA response that New Zealand held. We had at any one time about 400 birds in our facility. And on our biggest day for about 3 weeks, we had over 250 people in the wildlife response team. So there were 50 people, 20 people in the command centre, 80 people out in the field, you know, catching birds, monitoring, reconnaissance, doing all of those things, and 150 people in the wildlife facility. So that's a total of 250 people for about 400 birds. So as I said, general rule of about 100 to 50. So that's quite big. And, you know, 400 birds is not even a really large spill. When you go to things like Macondo, the Gulf of Mexico, and all those, you're talking in the thousands. So how does an oil wildlife response fit into an oil management system? So you can see here, this is a diagrammatic version of how wildlife fits in. So that wildlife fits in under operations and the wildlife branch manager. And then you have all these sections underneath, you know, shoreline cleanup, hazing and deterrence, boat cleanup, all of those things. This is just a diagrammatic view of it. I feel more comfortable showing you how New Zealand does it, given that that's the system I work in. So here is New Zealand's view. So here are the commanders, on-scene commanders in that system. Then you have, you know, intelligence, planning, operations, logistics, and admin. So everything circled in red and orange is the wildlife component of that, fully integrated into the system. So under planning and under intelligence, we have intelligence officers, and we have people manning hotlines for information coming in from the public. Under the planning team, we have wildlife planning officers that sit in the planning team. Under the logistics team, we have logistics officers that are specifically for the wildlife, and also health and safety people. But like I've said, the biggest proportion of us sit under operations. So this is the wildlife branch manager position, and then the rest of wildlife sits under this. Don't worry, there is more. So that's that same wildlife position, the wildlife branch manager, and this is how our decision tree breaks out. So this is where the field staff all sit. So you'll see there's a transport division, a species specialist manager, but then you've got onshore cleanup, boat people, marine mammal specialists, all divided into here. So this part in green is all in the field, and then this part in blue is all in the facility. So the facility is also divided up. You have, because the facility can be, 150 people, you have health and safety officers and admin people. You have autopsy divisions, you have a facility caretakers, people who are responsible for building the facility, all of those things. You have data processing and also autopsy section. And then this is the wildlife care section all in one. So you have field stabilization, then you have intake, stabilization, wash, rinse, dry, rehabilitation, and then you have everything else that goes on in the background, having to feed the animals, clean everything, feed the people, all of those sorts of things. So that was really just a very quick overview of how an Ord wildlife response runs, really emphasising on the first two sections. So looking at reconnaissance, monitoring, hazing and deterrence, but how hopefully you can see how the whole system works in with an oil response, not on its own. I think over to you, Lih Hern.
Thank you, Dr. Louise. I will take back control of the slides first. Right. Thank you again, Dr. Louise. So she has actually mentioned what is expected in the field, and that actually translate a lot of coordination requirement to the IMS itself, because what is needed in the field has to be managed and planned from the IMS for the planning cycle. And Dr. Louise also shared the very matured IMS, the structure that New Zealand has in place, which is they have a lot of wildlife specialists planted in different functions in the IMS structure itself. So that is a mature approach. But let's look back in the IMS for organization that still do not have any customization when it comes to wildlife response. So the wildlife branch, this have been open up my laser pointer. So this has been mentioned by Dr. Louise already. You have the few people, you have the facility people, so they are looking at different side of things. But I would like to actually zoom in into the rest of the roles in IMS, which can have wildlife response responsibilities. So this one thing, so wildlife branch director is often being held by the responsible party or the government trustee. So let's look at the other positions. So let's say, because for many organizations, IMS is already in place, and what can be quickly done is that, of course, they leverage on what they have in the IMS positions. So for IMS positions, the very first one that I would like to introduce is the environmental unit leader. And because under this person, his normal job scope will include identifying the resource at risk. So that is a form for this person to fill out. And this is usually done through surveillance and monitoring. So we have actually this link back to the initial response, the reconnaissance and surveillance. So this is this is how then it ties back to the IMS itself. So the person, the environmental unit leader, will be the one who collect all the data, all the information, and then at the same time, he or she will be the one who recommend response measures. Right? So because the wildlife planning specialist, if activated, likely will be sitting under the environment unit leader as well. So together, he or she will be able to provide recommended response measure, how to minimize impact on the species. So if you recall the 3 principles we mentioned just now. And of course, this all will support the formulation of IAP, and IAP is the one that determines the action to be done for the next operational period. And this person, of course, has to work in close interface with the operations section, the wildlife branch director, and the situation unit leader, as well as other sections when it comes to the planning cycle, which we will talk about it later. The next person that would be very much related when it comes to wildlife response is the SCAT technical specialist. So SCAT is the shoreline cleanup assessment technique. So usual conventional classic spill response SCAT will be activated first when there is imminent shoreline impact, and what can be integrated into the responsibility, of course, is to support the environmental unit leader to identify any sensitive resources, which would include the sensitive habitats, the ecosystem. So Dr. Louise has mentioned this just now in terms of the breeding ground, the roosting site, and feeding ground. So these are the things that could be on the lookup list for the SCAT specialist. And one of the role of the SCAT specialist is that during the survey, and one part of the survey outcome is to recommend cleanup techniques. And the cleanup techniques usually has the input of different stakeholders as well. So this cleanup plan, of course, to shoreline protection. So when it comes to wildlife responsibilities, then would also include the considerations to protect, because the larger impact that it has on the ecosystem. So this is for the care specialist. The last person that, of course, would immediately have a wildlife responsibilities would be the field observers. So this applies to anybody on the field that would be set under the situation unit leader to provide to collect information. So the information, of course, then would include any observation on wildlife in the field, which would trigger the needs for a wildlife branch. Let's say if they want to activate the remedy part of the wildlife response. These are immediate wildlife responsibilities for the different positions in a normal IMS, in a typical IMS structure. And then when it comes to decision making, it would then involve, we have to look into the planning cycle. So the planning cycle which is something that we are very familiar, and it has already set agenda for each of the meeting. But of course, the planning cycle is quite high level and more generic towards any kind of incident, and how then we could customize this planning cycle to take into account of wildlife response. This is what I'm going to talk about next. So first thing is, when should the wildlife response be considered during an incident? So definitely will be under the initial response and assessment. So when the incident happened, when the on-scene commander passed over the information to the incident commander. So one of the assessment they should actually think about if you recall about the PEAR priorities. So under environment, you should consider potential wildlife response already at the onset and not as an afterthought. So when it comes to reactive phase, in terms of what can help to conduct assessment. So if we still recall, under the initial reactive phase, there are a few forms that we can make use of. So we have the 201 form, and of course, the next one will be the 232 resource at risk summary. So this resource at risk summary is the one that help to list out what will be the resources, and these resources at risk should include any wildlife implications. So if we really need to enhance any situation awareness, if the information is still hazy at the beginning, because the on-scene commander or the incident commander will be able to deploy any field observers tasked to observe any specifically tasked to observe any wildlife potentially at risk. So this would help to formulate a quick response at the beginning. While we start to move into the proactive phase, and the very first thing that we look at, of course, is the objective meeting. So objective meeting is the one where the incident commander would set an objective for the operational period to be planned out for. And this, again, we would leverage on the information from ICS 232, which we mentioned just now, the resources at risk summary. This would come out. This will assist to come out with objectives related to wildlife, because if they have wildlife recorded, then this should be translated to actions that he wants the team to be to complete on the field for the next operational period. So the objective will be documented in the form, the objectives form, which is ICS 202. And if there's wildlife response, there should be a command emphasis, which is on proactive consideration of wildlife response. So if you recall the principles of wildlife response, we could be proactive. Keeping oil away from animal itself is part of a wildlife response. So if it is done with consideration of both the wildlife and other resources, it is already a success on its own. And one of the post-meeting would include, if let's say to a need to establish a wildlife branch, because if you have set up objectives that you would want to, example, to capture any wildlife, then a wildlife branch would then be necessary to be established, and this will be under the responsibility of the operation section chief. The next one will be under the preparation for tactics meeting. So the preparation for tactics meeting, the wildlife branch director will be heavily involved in this, and what he needs to do is, of course, to work closely with the operations section chief and the environmental unit leader to determine any wildlife response objectives, strategies, and tactics in the ICS 234 box. This would translate the objectives being required from the incident commander set earlier into strategies and tactics, because wildlife branch director has more specialized knowledge in terms of doing the translation to strategies and tactics. And he also needs to work closely with the logistics section chief on the resources needed for the strategies and tactics identified. This is done through the ICS 215 form. And lastly would be to work closely with the safety officer, identify hazard and mitigating measures in terms of the strategies mentioned earlier. So this is very relevant when it comes to the safety reminders that were shared by Dr. Louise earlier. So of course, we want to be safe for the people to conduct any capturing, but we also want to be safe for the animal. So it has to be a compromise, and the safety officer would definitely need some input from the wildlife branch director to ensure that the techniques being put in place is safe both for the people, the respondent on site, as well as for the wildlife which we aim to capture. So we do not want to create more harm in our response actions. So of course, this will be captured in the ICS 215A, the safety, the risk and risk hazard analysis form. The next one is preparation for planning meeting, which is quite straightforward. So after the tactics meeting, if there's any feedbacks gathered, so the wildlife branch director will work closely with the person I mentioned earlier to update all the relevant forms. Under the IEP preparation approval, so the wildlife branch director, again, we have to work closely with the operations section chief and documentation unit leader on developing the work assignment ICS 204, because the work assignment would be the briefing notes to be passed on to the individual teams that will be dispatched on site. When it comes to executing the plan, of course, it's straightforward. Just implement the work assignments that has been prepared based on the work assignment prepared. That's all what I have in terms of consideration we can customized to look into wildlife response when it comes to the planning cycle. And the last topic I would like to share is the challenges in IMS integration when it comes to wildlife response. I will share two challenges. So the first is that very usually response options are viewed in silos because when we are provided with the TPR views, so the TPR views is a good summary of all the tools that will be available to us, but it should not be looked in silos. So a very good example of how these different response options could be implemented in a way that complement each other will be the cone of response on the left. So on a typical response, all the response options in your TPR views should be complement each other in order to achieve the objective of minimizing the impact of the spill. So wildlife response should also be part of a cone of response, which is what we do not see right now usually. And of course, why we want to promote the integration of the wildlife response into other traditional responses because it is highly inefficient to just use response options individually compared to using it to supplement each other, because we may miss out any priorities. For example, when it comes back to the surveillance, you could make use of the same surveillance to look out at the trajectory of the spill, but at the same time, you could also make use of it to spot any wildlife presence. So this will also ensure the approach is more holistic. And we also have to acknowledge the fact that we have to appreciate wildlife response as part of the response toolbox. It should not be just look at it on its own. It should be considered early on because it is more expensive to remedy as compared to prevent and mitigate. So if we already are looking at the first two principles, when we plan for our oil spill response, it will be easier because we won't have to set up a remedy which is the wildlife response centers, which would require a lot of facilities and resources. Moving on to the second challenge, which is the unlimited wildlife response preparedness. One of the key things that we mentioned is that when we do the surveillance is that you need to have the ground truth of what's happening on the ground as compared to your wildlife response plan. And the wildlife response plan is very important because it gives you a preliminary information what is at risk, and those already provide good information. So what happens in this region is, of course, we have quite limited wildlife response preparedness, which including plans in many countries and in this region. So the plans would usually include the roles and responsibilities of the relevant government authorities, and this would be unclear in the wildlife response, which would lead to delay in any response because we then have to sort out who is responsible first before we go into the response itself. And the question, of course, is how can the industry and the government work together? Because the industry, we have a set of good practices, we have the community of practice that can be used when it comes to planning for wildlife preparedness, and that can be shared with the government. The next one occurs when another big part of the planning and preparedness is it comes with trained personnel, equipment, and facilities. So if you have a plan in place, you could have pre-identified which location could be used as a potential wildlife facilities and where you can find trained people and equipment itself. So this will be good information when it comes to preparedness. The last slide I would like to share is I mentioned we have not adequate preparedness in this region. So we have done a quick research on what is the level of preparedness in this region. So we have looked at the countries such as China, Japan, Korea, Russia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines. And there are different elements that we also try to look into. First is the regulation. Is there a existing regulation? So the regulation would normally then designate who is the responsible authority, and the responsible authorities would also be the one who produced the wildlife response plan. And some of the countries, although they don't have a plan, they would have a technical handbook that tells the responsible party what could be done, what is the suggested techniques to handle different species that is normally found in the country. And we also look at, is there any NGOs established in the countries, because these NGOs then would be the one who provide any trained equipment, trained people, and they could have facilities as well that can be used as wildlife response facilities. So that is what we look at, and I would not, of course, zoom into the individuals over here. It's just to provide a good summary of what we see in this region. So with that, that is the end of the webinar, and we come to the Q&A session. Let me look at the chat. Is there any questions? There's no questions in the chat box right now. And this is the opportunity for you to write down if you have any question.
Hi, Dr. Louise and Lih Hern. I have one question.
Yes.
So it was regarding the impact of oil on reptiles, for example, monitoring lizards and like crocodiles. Because recently there was one spill that we managed to have a footage of oil monitor lizards. But we just want to understand. I just want to understand like how oil will impact when the lizards or crocodiles get contact to the oil. Because for the seabirds, we kind of like have a little bit understanding on when it's oil on the feathers, it can disrupt their locomotions and disrupt their basically daily activities. But I just want to have a bit of understanding on how it will affect reptiles as well.
Really good question. So obviously they don't have feather or fur, so it's not going to disrupt that part of their system. However, they will inhale it, ingest it, and absorb it. So the main places of if you caught a manageable size animal, which is not a crocodile or a monitor lizard, but the first thing you would do is remove any oil from their eyes, from their nose, from their mouth, and from their anus, because that's where it's going to absorb the most and the most quickly. It's certainly an area where, if oil is in their environment, it's very likely that they could ingest it. And things like monitor lizards and crocodiles, for that matter, are likely to ingest other animals that have died from oiling or things like that. So that's definitely an impact that they will have. And also, for things like crocodiles and alligators and things like that, when they're sitting on the water's surface, when oil, diesel, heavy fuel or anything evaporates, if it's not blowing wind, the toxic part of the evaporation sits more or less in the top 10 centimeters just above the water's surface. And if you think of, a crocodile or an alligator just sitting on the water surface and their nose is just in that area, so they'll be inhaling a lot of those toxic fumes as well. So that's the three ways that it will still impact those animals, even if it's not impacting fur and feathers.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Thanks, Dr. Louise.